Welcome to the More Than a Worship Leader podcast. I'm your host, Gary Durbin. I've been a worship leader for over 20 years, and I've learned a lot from so many on this journey. On this podcast, we'll have conversations and explore the dynamics of leading worship in the local church. The concept of this podcast was inspired by my book, More Than a Worship Leader. But the concept of more than a worship leader was very much influenced by my dad. I grew up as a ministry kid, and my dad was a music minister my whole upbringing. He served at 7 churches in 6 states during his 40-plus years in ministry. And in 2014, he and my mom graciously stepped out of full-time ministry and took care of my grandparents in their final years. Now my parents are retired and enjoying life together. On this episode, in honor of Father's Day, I decided to interview my dad and talk about some of the things he experienced in ministry and explore the principles and values that he instilled in me as a worship leader. I was so blessed to be able to sit down and do this, and I'm sure this will be a blessing to you as well. So here's my conversation with my dad, Dwight Durbin. Well, today it's my honor to say a special welcome to the podcast to my dad, Dwight Durbin. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Gary.
A lot of time I think people use worship ministry or music ministry as kind of a stepping stone to pastoring. You never actually went to that lead pastor position, but over 40 years in music ministry, worship ministry, 6 states, 7 churches, I saw it all. So why don't we rewind and talk about your conversion to Christianity and then your eventual calling to ministry?
Yeah, Gary, I was 12 years old when I was introduced to a vertical relationship with God. I had a horizontal one, and I don't mean to sound anti-Catholicism, but I had my faith in a man, and I found out that I could trust the Lord, and I was saved as a 12-year-old young man, and I doubted my salvation. 15 years old, I got it square, but during that time I was growing, and I was very attentive in church, and that's how it all kind of began for me. And as I grew in my high school years, I started thinking about the future being in the ministry.
Yeah, and this would have been back in the 60s, right?
Yeah, I graduated in 72, so yeah.
Back in the 60s. So
late 60s.
The church scene back then is you're a teenager in church, newly converted to Jesus. But it's not like today where you're looking up at the stage and seeing a worship band and a worship leader, or even the staff looked a lot different, right? Staffing at churches.
Yeah, it was a smaller staff situation back in the days. You know, it was a pastor and an associate who wore a lot of hats.
What I remember you telling me is that there really wasn't a paid music minister, or what we call worship leader now, right?
Right. Matter of fact, they had a couple of guys in the church, and we were a pretty good-sized church in our small town. But guys in the congregation would lead the congregational music, and one would be a Sunday morning guy, one would be a Sunday night guy, but they were just lay guys in the church. And then after I went to college in 1972, BBC in Springfield, Missouri, they hired their first music director full-time. And, you know, it's kind of grown from there. But, yeah, that was a time in my life that I was really excited about what in the world I could do for the Lord in the music ministry.
That's cool. So you go to Bible college, you graduate from there, and then take us to the next step as you enter into full-time ministry.
Right. 1976, graduated, went to Decatur, Illinois, which was just 30 miles from my hometown of Taylorville. And the first ministry there, church was running about 800. They were on TV every week. They were on radio every morning. I had a Christian school. I wore so many hats. I learned so much. I was overwhelmed. And I was overwhelmed to the point of tears one morning when I was taking the radio broadcast, as I did every morning after we completed it, up the road 21 miles, and I heard a song called "He Was There All the Time." And I pulled off the side of the road because there was just so much going on in my life. And so I was just very busy. I thank the Lord for that time in my life because I learned so much, and it made me appreciate when the load got a little lighter later with maturity and experience.
Yeah, and I've obviously known you my whole life and I've heard a lot of stories. I've never actually heard that story. It reminds me of, times in my ministry where I was, overwhelmed, and now we call it anxiety. We call it even depression at times, where it's like we're so low and discouraged, and even we feel the weight of what we can't handle. And that, what you're saying is that existed
right
back in the day.
I was a newlywed. You were on the way.
Yeah.
And there was just so much on my plate. But that's what you did back those days. You just worked. And unfortunately, there was a philosophy of God, church, and family in that order.
Yeah, that I think what you're describing is what I would call a kind of old school mentality. And there's good and bad with that, with the old school. The old school mentality, when I see someone in ministry and I identify them with kind of that old school mentality, the first thing I think of is hardworking, and that they're not complaining. They're not, they're not protecting themselves so much, but they're thinking about others. The bad side of that is what you described, where sometimes we can put the church or the ministry in front of our family. And, sometimes we will work for a pastor or a church leader that will absolutely let us do that, and they're not looking out for our family.
Right. And a lot of guys in my, I don't know what you call them, my class at school or whatever in college, there's a lot of guys that in those early days, because of the demand on a new staff member in a church with the major conservative values, if you want to call them that, they didn't survive. Their mates felt pushed aside because of their work schedule. And I said all that to say this: it certainly honed my life to realize that how family was so much important to me. And, I worked through all of it, and it made me a better man because I was able to do that.
Yeah. Well, and because I'm your son, I can give insight into your story, because from my perspective, even though you had a lot of demands on you in full-time ministry, you were always at my ball games. You are always at the big things.
Yeah, I always try to protect, my wife and Patty, and of now almost 50 years, but and you and your brother Richard. I just always tried to protect you from the tough parts of it. Would I go back and change anything? Probably not. I mean, it was a stage of life. In the 60s, it was a conservative world, much more. And so it was the way it was, the way you dressed. I mean, I'd wear a tie every day at work,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, everything changes over time. But thank God for, the path that I was on. It certainly wasn't a bad path.
No. Yeah. And I view myself as a little bit of old school mentality, because I came into the ministry when, you still had to wear suit and tie, and maybe not in the office every day, but when you got on that platform, you got to dress your best, Sunday best.
Right.
And so now I'm, wearing jeans and t-shirt, and it's very casual. So anytime I hear anybody complain about anything with dress, I always laugh, because I'm like, you have no idea, young person, about what it used to be like and what the demands were. So you had a 40 plus year ministry run, the whole time doing worship ministry. You did, I mean, pretty much everything from, and you can help me with this. Like, I think of choirs, I think of hymns and congregational and quartets, Southern gospel, and then all the way to the contemporary worship era. You served and led through that. So
yeah, I was in a unique time where the worship music took over the hymns, and the youth department was doing music we didn't do in the church, and it was a time where I saw the hymns. I felt like I needed to insert back in the 80s. It was choruses. Then it became worship songs included with the hymns. But I always tried to keep a balance because I came into established churches. And established churches have established congregations, and there's a lot of history there. And I tried to shoot a shotgun with my music program based on the demographics. So it was a time where the 90s and the worship scene came on with praise and worship music, but I always thought, and I always kept in my mind, and I conveyed it to the folks, the worship music is new. I said Amazing Grace was new one time. So please accept and appreciate the new things that's come along, because He Lives didn't go back to the 20s, back in the early days. There's a lot of songs that we sang, and they become really, really strong songs. But it was a neat time because I watched the music change, and yet I couldn't leave behind the hymns in my own ministries. And then I watched the hymns change themselves, even in the style, and yet the melody lines and the truths in them, they all continued. I always thought that the worship music, as simple and vertical as it was, didn't replace the hymns. They were in addition to the hymns, because the hymns were loaded with the reasons why we worship. And the worship was something that we needed to have, in the services. So I always wanted to have an intimacy with God in the church services. And I always felt like, as I stood on the platform and leading worship, that I needed to go and lead them, but worship up there myself at the same time. I thought that was very important, because you can't give chicken pox if you don't have them, so to speak, I've always heard. But I wanted it to be so clear that the people would understand how important different music is in the service themselves, and appreciate a certain song that's not their cup of tea, but they look across the aisle and see another person getting something from it, and be mature enough to accept that and say, hey, let's do something for him or her, and the next song maybe do something more for me, and to see it happen around you, regardless of the style. It was doxology 1 minute, and then 4 minutes later it may be Chris Tomlin. It was just, that's where it got to. And I felt good about it, because I had felt like I had a balance in the ministry that I was in there. It's 16 years there in Savannah was our last full time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the idea of the teamwork between the old hymns and the new worship songs. I love that. That's a really cool thought about the fact that they don't have to go against each other, but they actually can work together if we're really leading worship correctly. And so when I think about you and I, both worship leaders, anybody who knows us knows that we have distinctly different styles when it comes to music, worship leading, and that is a simple explanation of eras and generations. Just a totally different generation that I grew up in. I really came up as the worship movement was starting. So I came through the worship wars and all of that, whereas you were in the tail end of it and were really had the heart to navigate and to help your church progress to that slowly. I was the 20-year-old coming up full steam ahead going, let's go with the new stuff. And I was very, very excited about that. So,
Right, Gary. I remember asking you, you were a senior in high school, and I remember asking you, Gary, the new music, you know, I get questions all the time. The new music, what does that do for you? I mean, the music the devil hated and still hates is the music that reaches people's hearts for God. I said, I asked you a question.
yeah,
Anyway.
you're talking about the contemporary.
Okay, yeah. So the contemporary music compared to the church music that we were using, and I was trying to use new choruses then and blending it even then. But does the music that you and your teenage friends, is that music reaching your heart, or is it just reaching your foot? You know? And you said, Dad, some of it does and some of it doesn't. Just like the hymn, some of it does and some of it. I said to myself, that's all I needed, because I had a lot of confidence in your judgment, because you were ahead of the game in your maturity, in my opinion. And I always thought that. So,
Well, when I think about our worship leading careers, if you will, there's definitely some differences, but there's also some really, really big similarities. When I think about myself growing as a worship leader, and I think about the influences on me, you could obviously go to the Matt Redmans, or the Matt Redman, Tim Hughes, Chris Tomlin, Darlene Check, Paul Baloche. I mean, there's so many artists that really influenced me. Late 90s, early 2000s. But when people ask me, like, who is like the biggest influence on me, the first person I say is Dwight Durbin. It's not, Matt Redman, Tim Hughes, Paul Baloche. And, some of it was musically. There's things that you taught me musically when I first got in. You taught me how to do choir. You gave me a crash course on that because I had to do choir for a while. But then there's vocal things. But here's what you taught me more than anything, and that was what you just talked about, was your ministry from the stage to the people. It wasn't about you being an artist. It wasn't about you looking good and sounding good. You wanted to make sure that people were ministered to. So I took that, and that, when you say I had a heart for this music, I didn't get that on my own. I learned that from you. So that leads us to more than a worship leader. You could argue that you are probably the biggest influence on this idea of more than a worship leader. So what I want to do right now is I want to hit some things that you taught me, and there's going to be some quotes, couple quotes, and then idea or two, and then I'm going to say them. And I'm going to compare it to the more than a worship leader concept. And I want you to respond to that. You'll probably be surprised about some of the things I remember. But in more than a worship leader, talk about the off stage and the on stage idea. So off stage is about loving people off stage, and then loving people on stage. So here's an off stage impact. Here's a quote that I remember you told me. And this was a long time ago, but I remember as a little kid you telling me this. You said, people have their own lives going on that don't totally revolve around your ministry. And you're talking about your volunteers. You're talking about people who come in and volunteer in the choir. So respond to that.
Well, it's so true. They don't have to be there, especially those volunteers underneath you, specifically in the music. And I have beat myself up a few times because I would sit there, and when it's time to start choir rehearsal, let's say, and I got people coming in late, well, okay. My first thought back in the early days was, hey, is their time more precious than all these people that came on time? No. And then, it didn't, when I hit 30, something happened to me. I started caring more about the reason why they were late instead of the fact that they were. And I've always told my boys, Gary, you'll remember me always saying this, that it's the people, the people is the cake. The music is just the icing, and you need it both. So, yeah, I was very At first I was thinking about my music like most 20, 25-year-olds. I was trying to build a program, but it was something that really came on to me. How that you love people, they love you back, and it was very important to me to see that they were glad what they were doing, and people wanted to be used. People wanted to be participating, and it was something that we just continually worked on, and it sure helped me to work when I thought about the people.
Here's another offstage impact quote from Dwight Durbin. People will tolerate your shortcomings because they know you love them.
Absolutely. They forgive me so many times. They've done things for me, and people will do things for you they won't do for a purpose or a program. They'll do something for you personally. And so I always approached it personally. Would you help me with this? Not that our church needs this, but that's going to be understood. I can explain that, but to get specific, I really need your help and to implement this or to do this yeah.
Here's an onstage impact, and this is a thought or really an example you showed me, but you connected with the congregation during the song. You got them singing. There was passion. There was engagement with the congregation during your songs.
I always believed that you wanted the level of worship to ring the bell in the auditorium. I felt the more participation and the more enthusiasm, the more worship could happen and was happening. But sometimes, you could lead one song, and then maybe a month later you lead the same song and you not have the same result. But my idea was to communicate to the people how important it was to be excited about what they were singing and think about the words and enjoy the ride with the music. I always thought that was very important. And sometimes I felt like I had to work on the platform to get the level to where I felt like there was energy, again, without losing sight of the worship. It's hard to take performance out of it, because if it doesn't sound good, people aren't going to want to be involved in it.
Yeah, we talk about that with my team. It's like you don't want to be a performer, but at the same time, there's no good reason to not do your best with music. And bad music can be a distraction as much as great music can be an inspiration to people. So
I always felt you can have a good church without good music, but I don't think you can have a great church without good music. It sets the stage, for the pastor, and makes his job a lot easier to walk in that pulpit. I always felt like the pastor should have the freedom after the end of the music program to walk to the pulpit and give an invitation. I wanted them to focus so much on what was being sung and who we were singing about, that the focus would forget what they left in the car and on the way to church and such, that they could focus on. Obviously, pastors don't do that. They have a message prepared, but I wanted them to have the congregation to have a mindset that would be, I guess, open to what the pastor was going to bring.
That's good. Well, you have had different titles: music minister, choir director, minister of music. Did you ever have like a title with the worship title in it? I can't remember.
I remember my first years as the music director of the church. I was always called the song leader.
Yeah.
And I never got, before I got out of full time, I never got to the media arts fancy term.
No one will let you edit videos, is what you're saying.
No, worship leader. A lot of times it depends on the ministry you were at or in, or visiting, singing, and they'll introduce you as the music director at such and such church, or in later years, it was the worship pastor or the worship leader at such and such church. Yeah, the title to me was, I always felt like I was the second man, no matter how many associates were on staff. I always felt like I was one of the second man because an old music mentor of mine, Earl Smith, he always said, "You're not number one on staff. The pastor's number one, but you're number one in your field. If you weren't number one in your field, then somebody else would be doing it."
Yeah. Well, you've had different titles, and more importantly, you've been in different eras. I mean, you've led worship in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. So as worship leaders today, listen to this interview, listen to this episode. What would be some advice you'd give them? Because you can give them advice, even though you're not full-time anymore. You still lead worship at times at different churches in your retirement years now. But what is some advice that you would give if you could just sit down with a young worship leader right now?
I think the biggest thing is, number one, don't forget where you came from. Don't take yourself too seriously, and think about those that are all around you as you worship. Don't ever lose sight of that. The fact that God has given you every ability that you have, and I guess really approach the platform as humbly as possible, because people will walk away thinking about you as somebody that wasn't into yourself as much as when you're a humble person. They'll remember you as that person, and they're more receptive if you have a humble spirit. I've felt like I'm almost 70 years old, and I feel like that I'm still learning, and I don't want to ever quit learning.
Well, I love that. I love the advice and the message and the hearts and the message of humility, because the opposite of that is pride, and us worship leaders can definitely be susceptible to that. We've got
absolutely, Gary, and we're the most visible ministry in the church. I mean, children's ministry, we could go on down the line. There's all kinds of ministries in the church, but we got half of that service that we're before those people, and we share that time with the pastor who's bringing the message, who's God's under shepherd for the people, and so I don't take that lightly. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to end this episode by just reading something that I wrote to you, and I think it's fitting, as we celebrate Father's Day. This is something I just sat down and typed out, so I'm just going to read it. Full-time worship ministry on stage for you is over. You don't do that anymore full-time, but I believe you will always minister. After you left full-time ministry, you took care of your parents, which is my grandparents, for several years. During that time, I watched you naturally minister to people you worked with, people you went to church with, even other staff guys who just needed someone who could relate and understand. And you ministered to me during that time because I got a divorce. And that showed me that parenting and ministry actually never ends. So thank you. Thanks for being an amazing example of someone who really and truly is more than a worship leader. You've loved people more than the stage. You've faithfully served pastors and churches, and you've mentored a bunch of guys in ministry. And most importantly, you've been an amazing dad. So
thank you, son. And I talk about you all the time. I should say I speak of you, but I am absolutely proud of what what God has done with you and has continued to do with you now, and watching you continue to grow and become the leader that you are.
Well, thanks, Dad. Happy Father's Day. My dad is one of those people who is loved by so many. And the reason is that he has loved so many people. Not with an agenda to magnify himself, but to truly minister to them and impact them with the love of God. As a minister and worship leader, he was a great example of not promoting himself, but prompting the congregation to look to God during a song. That's a great goal for all of us who have a leadership position in a church. Here's what I said about this in my book. Our lives are the one shot we have been given to do good for God's kingdom. We've got to guard ourselves against becoming an object of people's affection. Instead, let's influence them to worship God with their whole heart and make Him the object of their affection. You know, when I retire, I hope I can look back and see similar results as my dad's ministry. I hope we can all look back and say that it wasn't so much about our music, but it was about people and the glory of God. Because like my dad said, God has given you every ability you have. May we use our gifts to serve others with a heart of worship. Stay tuned for the next episode of the More Than a Worship Leader podcast. I'd greatly appreciate you subscribing and sharing. Thanks for listening.